Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the week two lecture. I know part one was long, so I'll try to keep this one relatively brief. But let's talk more about their work as healers. So I mentioned transculturation last time. Here we see a potential example of what anthropologists typically mean when they use that term. So think about the kind of medicine that these guys are practicing. It's described for us at a couple of points. So they're combining certain European practices with certain Native American medical practices. So they sort of use this blowing technique that was pretty common amongst a lot of Native American tribes. But they're combining that with the sign of the cross, which is, of course, a very Catholic gesture that comes directly from Europe. So this is kind of what we mean by the creation of a cultural hybrid. So we're taking some elements from Europe, some elements from local Native American cultures, and we're sort of combining them. We are blending them together, perhaps, to create something new. Now, do you agree that that is, in fact, what's happening here? Maybe. It's fine if you do. It's fine if you don't agree. Maybe you think what's happening here is actually sort of a scam. And we'll talk more about that because it gets very complicated. So essentially, as we learn, now they're in Mexico, they're still kind of in northeastern Mexico, but pretty soon they're going to change their route and they're going to start more of an overland route. So again, if you look at the maps on 38 and 39, you'll see that if they just continued to follow the Gulf coastline, they would have eventually made it to their original destination, which I would imagine probably would have brought them a little bit of satisfaction, perhaps, to know that they did make it, 5 to 7 years later. But instead, they change course. And this happens around page 138, I think is when he finally describes it. They change course and they start moving in a sort of northern and western direction. And that's how they end up eventually in northwestern Mexico, where they finally encounter other Spaniards. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's just think a little bit more about healing and how it works here, but also think about what starts to happen as they gain more and more followers. So we get a description of this around page 135. So by this point, they have a lot of people sort of in their retinue. They have a big following. So at every new village or settlement that they come across, they get more and more people joining up with them and journeying with them. And it seems like a lot of this has to do with their reputations as healers. But Cabeza de Vaca notices that something peculiar starts to happen as they go from village to village, as they encounter different tribes, new groups along the way. The Native Americans that they're with, the Native Americans that are traveling with them, will often present them, the Spaniards, to these new groups as healers. And there appears to be a transaction at work. So the new group will bring forth their sick and their injured for the healers to work on. But in exchange, the new group has to allow the Native Americans traveling with the Spaniards to basically take all of their stuff. So this gets mentioned in the intro. Our editors refer to it as ritual pillaging and exchange. So they coin a term for this. Cabeza de Vaca doesn't know what to call it. He doesn't really understand it. And he expresses that confusion beginning around page 135. And he's sort of troubled by this. To him, it looks a little bit like theft, because the natives that they're with are basically sacking these new towns or these new villages. They're taking all the possessions of the new group. So he describes this. The new group will bring, shoes and beads and other valuables in exchange for being cured. But it's not so much that, I mean, the Spaniards are getting some of these spoils for themselves, but it's really the other natives, the natives traveling with the Spaniards, who seem to be benefiting the most. So we get the feeling that Cabeza de Vaca becomes suspicious of this practice. He begins to think that the natives who are traveling with them might be taking advantage of these new groups. They might be using this pretext of healing, which again, the Spaniards aren't quite sure what to make of that because they don't really think of themselves necessarily as healers. At least they did not at first. But that quote from Cabeza de Vaca we saw at the end of part 1 suggests that maybe they're starting to think that they do have some ability. Cabeza de Vaca claims that he was the best healer of the bunch. He was the best physician. But what we definitely pick up on around this point is that he's confused by this cultural practice because there's not a precedent that he can lean on from Europe. There's not some easy comparison that he can make. So he's confused. He's just like, what's going on? This seems kind of wrong. But at one point, he says that the natives who are getting their stuff stolen from them tell the Spaniards, hey, don't worry about it. We feel compensated just by getting healed. And furthermore, don't worry about it because now we're going to join your crew and we're going to move on to the next town and then we're going to take all of their stuff. So Cabeza de Vaca is, kind of troubled, and the other Spaniards too. They're kind of not comfortable with it. But even the natives who are having their stuff taken, they are reassuring the Spaniards, saying, "Don't worry, it's fine. We're going to get ours eventually. We're going to go and pillage the next town." So this is clearly a pattern, and it makes sense to the natives, but it doesn't really make sense to the Spaniards. So over on 138 and 139, Cabeza de Vaca starts to say, I think they're being deceitful. I think that they're intentionally lying, the ones with us. I think they're lying to the newcomers about us, about our healing abilities, and they're just kind of using us in order to get all of this new stuff. So that's not a real favorable reading, but we can sort of understand why he might arrive at that conclusion. And also remember that folktale that the natives told them, back a few pages earlier, and remember their reaction to it. They're like, oh, that's not true. You guys are being crazy. You just need to be good Christians like us, and you won't have to worry about evil spirits or the devil or whatever. So it's almost, I feel like that's part of his general impression now. He's learned that the Native Americans have an oral storytelling culture. These tribes tell stories. Now, a lot of Native American tribes didn't have writing systems, but they did have complex literary traditions of their own. Those traditions just happened to be oral. So oral storytelling would not have been unfamiliar to Europeans, but the nature of the stories was different. The nature, the message of the story or the content of the story would have been different from what one would have encountered back in Europe. So I almost get the feeling at this point that Cabeza de Vaca is like, yeah, I don't know. These people tell stories. The stories aren't really true. It's almost like he's responding to their affection for fiction. He's like, they tell these stories, but they're clearly not real. So I think they're lying and being deceitful just so they can get new shoes and new bows and new possessions. But that's his perception. And we can see even from his own narrative that the other Native Americans don't necessarily feel that way. The Native Americans who are getting their stuff taken don't seem too worried about it because this is clearly a cultural practice that they're at least somewhat familiar with or they're comfortable with it, but the Spaniards are not. So that's just kind of interesting. Another one of these examples of cultures colliding. But maybe we're seeing a hybrid as a result, or maybe we're just seeing confusion at this point. Because again, the Europeans often rely on those pre-existing European precedents. And when those precedents start to run out, and now it's been years since the expedition began, so as the journey progresses, you'll notice that those old European precedents, those old European comparisons, they kind of fall away. They sort of go away because they're no longer relevant for the lives that these guys are leading now. So that's all rather strange, and I would like you to figure out what you think about those about this cultural practice that Cabeza de Vaca is describing around page 135 to 140. Some scholars say that, the mere presence of these Spaniards, it's already beginning to disrupt the social fabric of this area in Mexico. They're already starting to change the way the Native Americans behave and the way they interact amongst themselves. But that's just speculation. We don't really know that. So another possibility is that stuff like this always happened and the Spaniards are just now a part of it. But we also know a little bit about some of the spiritual and religious practices of some of these groups. And again, these are all slightly different groups. But as I mentioned in part 1, once the survivors get to Mexico, they notice that there's less conflict between various groups. And there seems to be a lingua franca, there seems to be more open communication, and there seems to be more kinship, more relationships between the groups that he probably cannot always identify. And again, that might be part of the reason why he stops naming these groups, because he might not be able to tell the differences between them, because often they all seem to be kind of working together, or at least they're pretty friendly with one another. There's not nearly as much conflict and violence in this particular area as there was back up in coastal Texas, further up the coast. So again, we don't know if the Spaniards' presence alone can account for what we're seeing here with this ritual pillaging. We don't know if that's a byproduct of the Spanish being there and being perceived as foreign or possibly supernatural. We don't know how many natives really believed that they were supernatural or that they were even actually healers. Again, Cabeza de Vaca, I think on 139 or 138, he suggests that he's suggesting that it's all deceit. That the natives that are with them don't even really believe that they can effect cures. They're just exploiting the Spanish for their own personal gains. And I would say if that's true, that just indicates that this is a very modern society that Cabeza de Vaca has stumbled upon, because that's a very modern thing to do. Find new and novel ways to make money, to gain material possessions. So that might be what they're doing. Or they might have done stuff like this previously, long before they ever saw Europeans or Christians. So we just don't know. But certainly this is strange, and it strikes Cabeza de Vaca as strange, and he can't fully account for it. He doesn't fully grasp it, but he is observing it, and he is writing down his thoughts and his theories. But we see another interesting moment right around this point in the narrative. On page 138, I mentioned this. This is where they make a turn inland, and they stop going the way of Panuco. It's not clear to me if they really grasp the fact that they're getting relatively close to Panuco. I don't really know how aware of that they are. But here we find a discrepancy between what Cabeza de Vaca is saying and what we have in the history written by Oviedo, which again, remember, was based on that joint account written by Cabeza, Dorantes, and Castillo. So this is interesting because we might have another example here of self-justification. Cabeza de Vaca basically saying, hey, don't blame us. We had a good reason for changing our route, even though if we had stayed, we would have made it to Panuco and things could have worked out pretty well. But instead, he claims that they turn away from the coast because they keep hearing rumors about other native groups who grow maize and have a lot more resources and are a lot more affluent, and they want to find those people. The Avavares are very nice, but they don't have a lot. They're not a very affluent group. So the Spaniards, being sort of practical minded, they're like, man, we want to find people with agriculture. We want to find people with more settled, more permanent settlements so they can take better care of us. Even though they're not slaves anymore, they're still suffering from hunger. They're often naked. They're in the desert. So as Oviedo, I think, points out at some point, they have freedom by now. They are free, but they're still experiencing a lot of hardships, so they want to find more affluent people who can give them more stuff. So they decide to turn inland so they can find some of these more affluent tribes that they're hearing about. Or at least that's the reason Cabeza de Vaca gives here. But if you'll notice the footnote on 138, we see that explanation was not provided in Oviedo's history. So that begs the question, is Cabeza de Vaca making this up in order to provide a good explanation for why the men changed course? It's just as likely, that's very possible. I think that they changed course perhaps just because they got lost. They're trying to follow various rivers, and maybe they just got turned around. Who knows? We'll never know for sure. But Cabeza de Vaca does offer a reason here for their change of route that he had not offered previously in the joint account that he wrote back upon his return to Spain. But of course, he was writing that joint account with Dorantes and Castillo. So maybe he sort of blamed them, but couldn't express that in the joint account. So he provides it here in his own personal account. But I don't know. We have to decide if we believe him or not. And then soon afterwards, on page 141, he mentions their great reputation that is beginning to precede them. So again, the new tribes that they encounter have often already heard about them. Word is spreading, so they're often received quite generously because these natives are sort of expecting them. Oh, the healers are on the way. And at each stop, they gain more and more followers. So I think on 143, he tells us that by now they have 3,000 or 4,000 Native Americans following them on their overland journey in a western direction. Now, is that an exact figure? Does he have any way of really knowing? That's debatable. I doubt he counted every individual person that was following along with them, but certainly there were a lot of people by this point. So again, their circumstances have changed so drastically since coastal Texas. Now they're really almost like celebrities. They're celebrated. They're given all these nice things. They're treated as being very important members of these Native American societies. And on 143, Cabeza is almost sort of like complaining about it. He's like, yeah, we had to bless everybody's food, and people had to ask our permission before they did stuff. So it's almost like complaining about being in charge or complaining about being celebrities. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're completely in charge at all times, because we did notice that even though they're uncomfortable with that ritual pillaging, they don't stop it. They either don't feel capable of stopping it, or they just don't want to bother rocking the boat, but they don't seem to have any influence over the natives. They don't seem to put a stop to that particular cultural practice. But in other cases, they're obviously very important figures, and they're treated as such. So they're in a pretty favorable position right now, and they keep gaining more and more followers. Eventually, they find the people of the cows. And this is one of the more advanced societies that they had heard about, that they're trying to find as they take this overland route. So they show you the route over on page, I think, 38 or 39 in those maps So you can kind of track their course. They leave the modern-day northeastern Mexico state of Tamaulipas, and they cross over into Nuevo Leon, I think, initially, and then they keep going west. And they eventually cross back over the Rio Grande, and they're back in modern-day Texas for a little while, probably close to the modern-day city of El Paso, and then they cross back over into what is now Mexico. And when they find the people of the cows, they find the first really permanent settlements and the first really large-scale agriculture that they've seen since the panhandle of Florida. So again, if there can be any doubt that this book, if nothing else, demonstrates that Native American culture was not monolithic, this book shows all the different variations of Native American cultures, how they were all different. They all had different practices. If there can be any doubt that this book does that, that doubt is eliminated by now because, again, they're finding a very different society. This is an advanced society. They have agriculture. They have dwellings that remind the Spaniards of houses. They use the term house to describe these dwellings because they look similar perhaps to European dwellings. So again, they're still using some of those old precedents, but they're struck by the sophistication and the relative affluence of this particular tribe or this particular group or community. And when Cabeza de Vaca says cows, he's almost certainly referring to buffalo. So Europeans had never seen buffalo before coming to the New World, so they would often call them cows, or they would use the names of other animals that they were familiar with. So again, they're somewhere around the Rio Grande, either on the Texas side or the Mexico side, but by now they've gone quite a bit further to the west. And it's around this point that they finally commit. They kind of get a sense that, okay, we're going west now. And they know that if they keep going, they'll eventually hit the South Sea. That's their name for the Pacific Ocean, which was discovered by Cortez about a decade earlier. So they know the Pacific. And they know if they keep going west, they'll eventually hit the Pacific. And I think also in the back of their minds, they know that if they get near the Pacific coast, they're going to eventually run into more Spaniards. So around page 148 or 150, they decide that they're fully committed to this overland route. They know, I think by now, that they're no longer on the way of Panuco or the way of the Palms, but they're okay with that because they know they can't turn back, really. It would be better at this point to just keep going west until they hit the Pacific. But just keep in mind the staggering extent of their travels. They started in Tampa Bay. They end up near the Pacific coast in northwestern Mexico. But of course, it takes them about 7 years to make the trip. So, the people of the cows grow maize. So they have agriculture. I think they might even have some metalworking, which is a sign of this to the Spaniards of sophistication and kind of a more advanced society. So they stay there for a while, and then they keep pushing westward. And they're in a very populous land. We should notice that. You know, in big parts of Florida, like the peninsula, not italicized Florida, in big parts of Florida, along the Gulf coasts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and certainly coastal Texas, the populations are kind of sparse. Because again, many of the tribes are semi-nomadic. Now, the settlement of Appalachian in north central Florida, that was big, that was settled, and they kind of got run out of there because they entered into conflict with the local natives. But for a long time, they haven't seen those kinds of societies, but they are seeing them here in roughly north central Mexico. So again, very different than those hunter-gatherers that enslaved them back on Mojado. So now we kind of have a sense of where they're going geographically. And one of the final things I want to talk about as we wrap up here, I want to talk about Estevancia, the African slave who's a very interesting figure, not because Cabeza de Vaca talks about him very much, because he doesn't, but rather because of the role that we see Estavancio filling near the end of the narrative. So we don't get a lot of detail about him. Like I've mentioned, historians think he was probably from North Africa, maybe Morocco, which would have meant that he was Arabic speaking and possibly, likely, a practicing Muslim. He might have converted to Catholicism by this point. Again, I think he belonged to Castillo. But if any of you know a little bit about the history of Spain, you'll know that Spain has quite a long history with North Africa, and back in the Middle Ages, Spain was actually conquered by Moors from North Africa. These were Muslims. Many of them were Arabic speaking, although some of them spoke other languages, I think, but they conquered and ruled Spain for much of the medieval period. But not long before the age of exploration, white Christian Spaniards sort of became ascendant and essentially expelled a lot of the Moors, a lot of the Muslims from the country. They also expelled many of the Jews from the country. That was actually going on right up through the early stages of Spanish exploration. We don't need to get too far into this, but there's kind of a parallel, there's kind of a link between what they were doing to Muslims and Jews in Spain and what they were doing to Native Americans in the New World. There is a parallel there, but we don't need to pursue it too far because this is not history class. But just keep in mind that a few centuries earlier, Estavancio could have been a very influential member of Spanish society because many Moors, many Muslims who came from North Africa settled in Spain, and then they were there for many generations. So by the time Estavancio comes along, however, the balance of power has shifted. And now there's not really a place for Muslims in Spanish society other than the place that Estavancio occupies, which is slaves. They occupy servile positions, or they're just getting killed and expelled entirely. So he is a slave. But what we'll notice is he takes on some really important responsibilities. And Cabeza de Vaca treats him probably the way we would expect a white Spaniard to treat an African slave during this period of history. He's very dismissive in many ways. He doesn't really refer to Estavancio by his name like he does for Dorantes or Castillo. Instead, he usually refers to Estavancio merely as the black man. But Cabeza de Vaca points out some of the things that Estavancio was doing. He often serves as an interpreter. He seems to have an important role in talking to some of these new Native American groups that they encounter. He also serves as a kind of scout or guide. He's often sent out in advance to kind of map out the next phase of their journey. So we actually see a little bit of this if you guys turn to page 153. Again, we don't get a lot of detail. Cabeza de Vaca does not develop this very much, but he does mention it. About halfway down the page on 153. Now, he's talking about a specific group of Native Americans here, but these descriptions of Estavancio, I think, apply to the larger journey. The black man always spoke to them and informed himself about the roads we wish to travel and the villages that there were and about other things that we wanted to know. That's just a classic Cabeza line. Other things that we wanted to know. That's very vague. That can be any number of things, but he doesn't really elaborate. But just notice what he's telling us. Estavancio is moving ahead of the group. He's finding the roads that they're going to take. He's sort of getting a lay of the land. He's visiting the villages in some cases ahead of time. And it almost seems like he's functioning as a sort of emissary. He's going to these new groups and perhaps telling them, hey, the healers are coming. Now, I'm not sure. It's not made clear if Estavancio functions as a healer or if he is kept separate from the 3 white Spaniards. That's not really made clear unless I'm forgetting. But we do see that he has a unique role. We don't get as being a scout, being an interpreter. He's the one who's often speaking to these new native groups. So that suggests to me that he might have the best grasp on all of these different languages. Now, we do get the sense that Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, and Castillo also pick up at least parts of these languages, but we get the feeling that maybe Estevancio really specializes in both navigation and language acquisition. So that's all cool, but what's really interesting is it seems like he's not really functioning as a slave anymore. Remember, he belongs to Castillo, or maybe Dorantes, one or the other. But we don't get the sense that those guys are going with him on these scouting expeditions. These guys aren't going with him to talk to the next tribe or to visit the next village. So he seems to be operating here with a lot of autonomy, which is pretty interesting to observe because it almost certainly would not have been that way for him back in Spain. So when people talk about this text providing templates for future U.S. literature, think about Estevancio. Here's an African slave, probably born as an Arabic-speaking Muslim in North Africa. Then he's captured, made a slave in Spain. Now he's journeyed to the New World. He's one of just 4 survivors of the Navarrete expedition. He's still with his master, but he doesn't really seem to be functioning as a slave anymore. He's being given new responsibilities. He's given a new degree of freedom. And he's also interacting with all of these different Native American groups. So in some ways, Estevancio is kind of creating a new identity for himself. Now, it's short-lived, as we're going to see in a moment, but maybe all of these guys are sort of doing that in their own ways. Cabeza de Vaca and the other white Spaniards, maybe they're also creating new hybrid identities based on this combination of their old European culture and these new Native American cultures that they're being exposed to. I don't know. That's certainly a possibility, and it's cool that Estevancio is doing all this stuff and playing this really important role in these final stages of the expedition. And I want to go to another scene before we leave him. I want to go to another scene on page 159. This is one of my favorite parts of the book, and it's one of the most revealing moments, I think, because for one of the few times that I can recall, Cabeza de Vaca offers a little bit of a slight dig into the ribs of his fellow white Spaniards. And I want you to notice who he turns to at this pivotal moment in the narrative. So over on page 159, by this point we're getting near the end. They still have this big following. They're still working as healers. But now they've gone so far west that they start to realize that they're getting close to other Spaniards. They're starting to get close to Spanish settlement. So they're hearing rumors from Native Americans, some of the Native Americans that they're traveling with. They're hearing rumors about a slaving expedition that's taking place in northwestern Mexico. But they also start to see traces of Spanish presence, like armor and various pieces of equipment that have been discarded. So they know they're getting close, but they're not sure how close. So on page 159, Cabeza de Vaca wants to go ahead and kind of finish this journey. He wants to make a final attempt to find the nearby Spanish. So he goes to his 2 fellow white Spaniards. This is about midway down the page on 159, the only full paragraph on the page. That night, I entreated one of my companions to go after the Christians who were going through the area the area that they're in. He says it was a 3-day journey. But the footnote tells us that here, as in other places, Cabeza de Vaca is inserting information that he learned at either an earlier or later date. Like at this point, he would not have known that it was a 3-day journey. He's just he could have guessed or speculated, made an educated guess, but he didn't know. He only learned that later after making the journey. But he does that a lot. He'll insert facts that he learned at a later point because they'll help to explain the present moment in the narrative. So it's a 3-day journey, and he goes to either Dorantes or Castillo, he doesn't specify which, and he asks them, hey, come along with me, let's finish the job. They judged a troublesome undertaking. So both of them refused to go. They judged it a troublesome undertaking, excusing themselves because of fatigue and hardship. And in spite of the fact that each one of them would be able to do it better than I on account of being hardier and younger. So this is a rare moment where Cabeza de Vaca offers a little bit of editorializing, a little bit of his own personal opinion. So he says, yeah, I asked them to come, but they both claimed that they were too tired, even though they're both younger and stronger than me. So I like this part always makes me laugh because he's kind of throwing some shade at these two guys. He's saying, yeah, they didn't want to make the journey, but who does make the journey with him? Estevancio and a whole bunch of Native Americans. So he goes on to say, but seeing their will, seeing how defiant they were being, they're refusing to go. So seeing that, the next day in the morning, I took with me the black man and 11 Indians, and they followed the trail that they had found, and they completed the journey. They eventually do cross paths with that slaving expedition that had been mentioned previously. So again, it's Estevancio who comes with him, not Dorantes, not Castillo. Estevancio and 11 native followers. That's really significant. So when Cabeza de Vaca finally lays eyes on other Spaniards for the first time in 7 years, his companions consist of Estevancio and a bunch of natives. No other white Spaniards are with him at that point. So, yeah, keep that in mind. Estevancio takes on a big role, and he just seems better at doing stuff. Like, he's got more energy, he's tougher, he's got a better knack for language, he has a better knack for navigation. So it's him that they really rely on as their journey continues, not Dorantes, not Castillo. So that's telling, and in the hands of a more modern, less racist author, that would be developed and discussed and analyzed. But notice that Cabeza de Vaca doesn't seem all that interested in talking about Estevancio at length. We don't really find out what happens to him after they are rescued. We know that the 3 white Spaniards all end up back in Spain. But I'm not sure if Estevancio at some point is granted his freedom or if he has to return to Spain along with Castillo. I don't know. And Cabeza doesn't seem all that interested in him. But we do see the role he plays and the importance that he has in the later stages of this expedition. So by now, they're in northwestern Mexico. They find the slaving expedition, and their journey pretty much comes to an end. But just notice that right as all of this is happening, we're getting some of these relations from Native Americans delivered by Cabeza de Vaca. We're learning about these atrocities being committed in the area by these Spanish slaving expeditions. So this is a really important juxtaposition. We've just seen transculturation, I think, at least in some forms. We've seen this weird journey through Mexico where the Europeans, this African guy, and a bunch of Native Americans are all living together pretty peacefully. And they're sort of creating a new culture, maybe a new hybrid culture. And there doesn't seem to be a ton of conflict. There doesn't seem to be a ton of violence or bloodshed. There is some ritual pillaging. But as we saw, The Native Americans seem largely okay with that. The Spanish are weirded out by it, but this does seem to be a pretty tranquil existence until we run into more Spaniards, until we run into the slaving expedition. So now we return to reality. The way that a lot of people read this narrative is that Cabeza de Vaca sort of stumbles ass backwards into a different vision of what Spanish colonialism could look like. A different vision of how the Spanish could come to control this huge swath of land. And as Cabeza de Vaca tries to explain to the slavers at the end, hey, we don't have to be so violent. We don't have to rip these people out of their homes and force them to work for nothing. We don't have to do that. These people are pretty reasonable. We've been living with these people for years. They've fed us. They've treated us well. We've kind of assimilated into their societies. These people grow crops. These people have pretty sophisticated social organizations. These people are pretty advanced. They would make pretty good subjects. We don't have to terrorize them. We don't have to slaughter them. We don't have to enslave them. But notice how the slavers, these other Spaniards, react. It's a collective shrug, you know? They're just like, what are you talking about? To the slavers, all the Native Americans are the same. So they don't care about these native customs, their unique cultures, their relative advancement. When it comes to agriculture and knowledge of the terrain, they don't care. They just view the natives as free labor. So there's actually some conflict between Cabeza de Vaca and the other Spanish. They kind of get tired of him telling them what they should do. But here we get some social commentary, or at least the closest thing that we'll ever get to social commentary from Cabeza de Vaca, especially beginning around like page 161. He kind of offers his view, like here's how we could settle these people. Here's how we could deal with these people. And again, his vision is a little bit different from what the Spanish were actually doing. Because of his unique experiences, he has a different conception of how this colonizing mission can go. He has a more sort of tranquil, peaceful vision. And he does have, I think, you guys might disagree, but I think by this point he does have pretty genuine affection for a lot of the Native Americans who have been traveling with them. But you have to decide what you make of this guy, because it is important to point out that even though he has a pretty favorable impression of these Native Americans, he still believes that they should be subjects of the Spanish crown. He still wants them to convert to Christianity. He still wants them to basically be under the thumb of King Charles back in Spain. So don't lose sight of that. He still believes in the Spanish colonizing mission. He still believes that these people in what is now Mexico should be ruled by the Spanish king across the Atlantic. He's still on board with all of that. He just thinks that they could use gentler methods. He doesn't think they have to be so violent in the process of kind of, subjugating the natives. So we might stop short of really viewing him as a hero, but it is important to note that he has a different vision for colonization, a vision that was really ignored. Most Spaniards didn't really want to hear what he had to say, and it's not like his theory or his approach was ever really adopted in any kind of official, large-scale way. So he's kind of shuttled out of there, along with the other survivors. They're kind of, they're kind of escorted out of that region of northwestern Mexico, and eventually they leave Mexico altogether, or at least the 3 white Spaniards do. So, at the end, we have to decide how are we going to position Cabeza de Vaca, because for a long time, especially early in the 20th century, a lot of scholars read him very favorably. And they were like, oh, he's kind of the benevolent conquistador. He really loves his Native American companions and he wants what's best for them. But now, in our present moment, we're pushing back a little bit. A lot of scholars are pushing back on that perception, and they're saying, well, he's certainly better than Cortez. He's certainly better than the guys on the slaving expedition, but he still supports the larger colonizing mission. He just wants to do it in a less bloody, less violent way. So he's still supporting it. He's still a part of it. So maybe we want to temper our enthusiasm for him a little bit. But yeah, you have to decide, how do we read the conclusion of this narrative? Do we really believe that Cabeza de Vaca kind of has a change of heart over the course of this narrative, brought on by his fantastical experiences? Like I said, sometimes this almost reads like a novel. Some scholars consider it to almost be a novel because of the fantastical things that happen in the plot line. So because of all these extraordinary things that happen to him, and because he does live amongst Native Americans for so long, does he really change his way of viewing them? Does he come to see them as being sort of equal to himself and other Spaniards? I'm not convinced, but there's some evidence that supports that. I think there's some other evidence to the contrary that might suggest that he's still working with old European social hierarchies, which would put Estevancio and the natives well below him. But at the same time, even though that's true, he does gain knowledge. He does learn a lot about these various Native American cultures. That's beyond dispute. But the question is, what does he do with that knowledge? Does that knowledge make him a better person, a more understanding person? Or does that knowledge simply give him a slightly different theory on how to conquer Native Americans? So you might just read this as another conquest narrative. It's certainly different than a lot of other conquest narratives, but the way we end up, that hybrid culture that we were enjoying for much of the second half of the narrative, it gets abruptly ended by the conclusion of the narrative. So maybe by the end, we're at the same place that we end up with all the other conquest narratives. We just end up, once again, with the same story that gets told over and over again in the Americas. Europeans coming over, exploiting Native Americans, killing Native Americans, forcing Native Americans to assimilate, and of course taking their land. It's all playing out. By the end of the narrative, we see all of that. It's not necessarily Cabeza de Vaca, Estevancio, and the other two who are really doing the conquest. They're not really conquerors. They sort of set out to be, but that's not what this journey had in store for them. But even though they're not conquering, perhaps they're establishing some groundwork for future Spaniards to achieve future conquests. So that might be all this is to you, and that's fine. But maybe it's also the story of personal growth, some kind of illumination, transculturation. I think transculturation occurs. I think we get a brief sort of utopian glimpse of what the new world could be, what a new hybrid culture could be. But it doesn't last. It doesn't last because that vision, what we see for much of the second half of the narrative, that's not ultimately what the European powers decided to do when it came to colonizing the New World. So that's it. I'm tired. I'm going to stop here. I know both of these, I know part 1 and part 2 are equally long. I apologize. I hope you guys can watch these at your leisure. Please let me know if you have any questions as we wrap up the narrative. And I hope you guys enjoyed it, or at least at minimum, I hope you found it kind of interesting and strange. So we're moving on. Next week, we're going to read some Native American folk tales, and we're also going to check out excerpts from John Smith's expedition narrative. But we won't talk very much about Smith. I'll just kind of cover some stuff with him briefly. I want to spend most of our time on the Native American folk tales. We'll talk more about the trickster character that we saw briefly here. And we'll explore the literary traditions that already existed in North America before the Europeans arrived. So I'll see you next week. Let me know if you have any questions.